Bonjour, my name is Carol, and for my French 101 project, I decided to research the origins and cultural significance of French pastries and bread. So today, what I'm attempting to do is to make some French baguettes. I had to restart because my first batch did not go so well. So what I'm starting with is just four basic ingredients, which is yeast, bread flour, salt, and water. And while I'm doing that, I am going to tell you a little bit about the history of bread in France. So just so you know where I am in the process, I dissolve the yeast in warm water. It's added to the flour and salt, and now I just formed like a tacky dough. This particular recipe doesn't really need too much kneading. So I'm just going to finish mixing it. I'm going to knead it. And then it has to go into a grease bowl and be placed in a warm area where it's going to hopefully double in size. And then I'll take it from there once we get there. So prior to the French Revolution, bread and salt were two essential elements in the French cuisine. Bread was such a significant part of the culture there that bakers were considered public servants, and providing bread was a public service. So the average family spent about 50% of their daily wages on bread because it was a good filler. There were incidents of bread riots which occurred throughout France when bakers tried to charge too much for bread, and if the people in that town felt that the charges were unreasonable, these bread riots would occur, where they'd basically go in and ransack a baker's house. They were usually nonviolent in nature, but it sent the baker a clear message about what was reasonably charged for bread. Then in 1788 and 1789, prices of bread rose due to failed crops. Two essential ingredients in French cuisine at the time were bread and salt. And at the time when the failed crops occurred, of course the price of bread rose. And simultaneously, the government was placing a tax on salt. So while this wasn't a direct cause of the French Revolution, it definitely was two factors that played a part in the unrest of the people of France and the monarch that were in charge at the time, which was Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette. Then in July 1789, the storming of the Bastille, or if I'm saying it French properly, I think it would be Bastille, they were actually beheaded, and the Republic of France was born. It had been rumored that Marie Antoinette, when there was a shortage of bread and the bread cost so much, that she was quoted as saying, to the poor people of France, let them eat cake. I read several theories on it, and there was nothing that proved that she actually said it. But there were other theories that said that she said it, and when she said let them eat cake, it didn't mean cake like we're used to eating with frosting and deliciousness. She was referring to the buildup of in the ovens when bread was made. It was called cake. However, I couldn't find anything in history that actually proved that she was the one who said that. And there was one theory stating that it was another princess that said it, but just a little information there. So it's during the time of the Republic of France, the guild system was dismantled, and restaurants began thriving throughout all of France because people were choosing to be bakers and pastry makers and such. So the first restaurant was established in 17 1882, that's where the idea of menus came from and individual seating, and that's where it was born. So one of the best known breads in France is the baguette. Okay, it gets its name from its shape, which means baton or stick. After the revolution, it was another theory that this bread became known as the bread of equality because the government wanted to provide quality bread for everyone in France, whether they're rich or poor. At the time when the baguette was being made, it was reported back from tourists that some of the loaves were as long as 6 feet. And women could be seen carrying them in bunches over their arms into the bakeries and such. But then restrictions were put on bakers. They weren't allowed to bake between 10 p.m. and 4 a.m. So the baguettes that we know today, that are a little shorter and thinner, were said to be made that way because this allowed the bakers time enough to bake the bread before their first customers arrived in the morning. So that traditional 6-foot loaf was no longer something that you could find. So back in the 18th, 19th century, bread was made from something called levain, or louva, which is another word for starter. And if you know anything about baking bread or anything in the baking world, it's a starter is, some people call it a sourdough starter in the United States. And it was actually just flour and water that was able to sit for long periods of time, and it developed wild yeast and bacteria all on its own without any of the commercial yeast that we use today. Some people would have starters for years and years, and they would use that starter to start their bread. That process allowed those ingredients to form molecules that made the taste of the baguette very different from the baguettes where we use the commercial yeast. So, and along came the Industrial Revolution, and with that, people wanted to make things more quantity and faster. So kneading machines came to be, and unfortunately the kneading machines compromised, along with the new yeast, compromised the taste of the baguette even further. So bakers making those with the kneading machine started adding additives like salt to try and compensate for the flavor that was missing from that long fermenting process. But because of this, the bread really didn't taste so good, and there was a decline in the amount of bread that people were eating. Then in 1990, a gentleman named Lionel Poulin began returning to the old ways and using the natural way of fermenting the bread, and using those 24 hours to let the bread rise and bring back that old flavor that the baguettes once had. And so once he started doing this, other bakers started to follow in his footsteps. And then in 1993, the government actually stepped in and said, if you want to call your French baguette a traditional French baguette, it could only have the 4 ingredients of water, bread, salt, and yeast, and no additives. This was really helpful to the traditional bakers because, as you can imagine, you had a lot of commercial places like supermarkets starting to make baguettes that just really didn't even compare to those of the traditional baker. So the government stepped in and said, these are the guidelines that you had to use in order to call your baguette a traditional French baguette. Okay, I'm just going to knead this a little, and as I said before, I'm going to put it into a bowl that is lined with oil. I'm going to put it in my oven, which is off, but it's a warm place, even though it's really warm out today, no matter where you are in my kitchen. So I'm just going to knead this a little bit. And really, that was the history of bread. There were workers who, used to work in the bakeries back in the old way that actually got tuberculosis from being there for so many hours and inhaling the flour. Hopefully we don't have that anymore today. So that is the history that I know of, that I researched for this particular project. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put this in a bowl, put it in the oven, let it rise. I'm thinking maybe 45 minutes to an hour. And then I'm going to cut the bread into and shape them into the loaves, and they're going to rise again before I bake them in the oven. And when that is happening, I'll come back and I'll tell you a little bit about what I know about pastries of France. But I really did concentrate on the bread and the baguette. But I do have a little information. So I'm going to shut this off for now, and I'll be back when the dough has hopefully risen.